Thanks, Gary. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. So actually, Gary misread my title, except I actually changed my title to exactly what he said. So he and I were thinking the same, even though he didn't mean to. I was tasked with telling you why patients should know about biosimilars, but that was only the first 4 slides. But then, of course, we need to answer a few other questions. Now, out of full disclosure, I do consult for some of the companies that are involved in producing biosimilars. But this presentation is really 100% my own, and I take responsibility for it, of course. But the other disclosure I have is that I'm currently the chair of the Government and Industry Affairs Committee of the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, and that has informed some of what I have to say today. So I actually broadened my talk. It's going to be about why patients should know about biosimilars, what patients should know about biosimilars, and how can they learn about them. So this is really meant to be very practical for you when you start talking to your patients about this, and hopefully when you advocate on behalf of your patients and encourage them to do so for themselves. So why should patients know about biosimilars? Well, that's almost rhetorical. Of course they should know about these agents because they're going to be receiving them. And this has to do with our relationship and what has traditionally been called the doctor-patient relationship, but of course is the provider-patient relationship. And that has to do with the choice and communication of therapeutic recommendations must include disclosing all appropriate treatment options, disclosing potential benefits and risks of these treatments. And of course, in the modern era in the US and elsewhere, after we do all that, we leave the room and then a payer gets in the middle. And that's a challenge for many of us, as we all know. It also has to do with respect for patient autonomy, which is the cornerstone of our shared decision-making model in taking care of these individuals, and understanding that patients have the right to refuse our recommendations, which of course occurs frequently. And lastly, having patients informed and knowledgeable about their treatments and their management of their disease has been shown to enhance compliance, and it allows additional informed and evidence-based decisions to be made on their behalf. So there's many reasons that you should be making sure your patients know and understand this. Now, of course, in order for you to do that, you have to understand it. So I'm grateful to my colleagues who have led the way today to give you some of that background, and I'm, of course, not going to repeat that. Now, there's actually a nice study in the IBD journal, the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation's journal, that is actually available online right now. And this was led by Brennan Spiegel and his group at Cedars-Sinai, where they actually looked at the risks and benefits of biologics in IBD among patients using Twitter and e-forum discussions. So if you want to know how to use social media to get a publication in the IBD journal, I encourage you to read this paper. They looked at over 3,000 social media sites in the last few years, and they identified major concerns that came up. And you should notice that among those concerns that were voiced by the patients, it included non-biologic treatment alternatives, hesitation to initiate biological therapies in general, not just biosimilars, and the concept of changing or discontinuing regimens, as we know from our own practice. But this is what's going on out there, and they were able to quantify this using sort of a social research project, and it was quite interesting. We also know, though, that patients have some perspectives on biosimilars, and because these agents have been available and are being used in Europe and Asia years before they have now arrived in the United States, we can look to our colleagues in Europe who have studied some of this. This is a survey by the European Federation of Crohn's and Ulcerative Colitis Association to its members who have inflammatory bowel disease. These are patient members, and it was performed in 2014 to 15. So this was right when biosimilars were becoming available in Europe, so in the early phase of everything. And about 45% of them were currently being treated with biologics, and only a third of those patients had heard, or a third of the patients in the survey had heard of biosimilars. Now, of those who had heard of biosimilars, they had some concerns, and I suspect our own patients in the United States have similar concerns. They worry about a safety profile, they worry about efficacy, they think that a lower cost of a biosimilar, or for that matter, any agent, should not come before their safety and efficacy. I think that certainly makes sense. And they want to know whether they're receiving the reference drug or the biosimilar and have any additional information necessary in writing before the drug becomes is administered to them. So I think those are reasonable concerns they expressed, and you can see that a majority of patients said that that was important. In addition, they felt that extrapolation made sense, or at least a small number of them did, so the majority did not understand it in this survey. They were against the idea of interchangeability. About 20% of them said that if they were not aware, they thought it was not a good idea, and only 30% of them said that they would be fully confident even if their physician said, I'm comfortable with this. Now, this was a couple years ago. There hasn't been a follow-up survey of patients, but we can look at what the physicians in Europe have learned. And in this, I wouldn't call it longitudinal, but I would say 2 time point survey of the European Crohn's and Colitis Organization physicians. In dark blue is 2015, more recent, and light blue is 2013. You can see the confidence and comfort level with biosimilars changed over time among our colleagues in ECCO. So in other words, before they had the agents and were using them, there was lots of hesitation and concern. After the agents were actually available and being used, people were more confident and were comfortable using them. We don't know that this is going to be the same case as patients start receiving the drugs, but I actually think they will, and I think that Brian has made the case as well that this is almost a non-issue. It's going to be happening, and the more people are familiar with the agents, the more comfortable they may be. So those concerns and the minority of patients who said they were okay with biosimilars from a couple years ago are probably now outdated. What should patients know about biosimilars? Well, you've heard very nicely from the previous 3 speakers a bit more about what biosimilars are, how they're regulated, how they've been tested or tried, and what's happening in the world of biosimilars and specifically in IBD. But what should patients know about them? So I tried to focus in on what we should be communicating to our patients. The first one is that we have to try to explain to them that they're similar and what that actually means, and you've heard the definitions. As we try to do this with patients, we want to hesitate and avoid using the term, this is a biologic generic, and that's not accurate, so we need to try to use the right terms. In general, we've accepted the extrapolation studies. You heard that the regulatory bodies have, and we, as physicians who have been studying and understand this a bit more, do as well, and we should tell our patients that. But patients should be asking and know what drugs they're receiving. They should know how their payer or insurance company or health service is positioning the agents, and they should know whether this will cost them more or less. We always talk about cost savings. We don't necessarily know that there may not be other costs to them if these agents aren't delivered properly or there are other challenges to getting them efficiently to market and to our patients. It's also important to at least acknowledge and understand this distinction. The FDA does have a designation called interchangeable, and that no biosimilar in the U.S. currently has an interchangeable designation. That does not mean that these agents are not going to be switched, and it is happening, as you've heard already. And it's something that you have to keep in mind, and whether or not you pick that battle to fight in individual patients will depend on your comfort level and on evolving information as we are going along here. As Brian already outlined for you nicely, we don't yet have a study that shows the interchangeability as the FDA has outlined it, which would be back and forth between the reference product and the biosimilar or multiple biosimilars. That hasn't been performed yet. And so the general concept of switching in a stable patient hasn't really been proven to the level that we might want it to. On the other hand, using a biosimilar as a first-line biologic in a patient seems completely reasonable based on what we've understood. So you can also think about the individual patient in front of you and the clinical scenario you're facing as to what you'd want to educate them about. For example, a new start, in general, using a biosimilar as their agent or versus the reference product seems reasonable. If it's a primary non-responder, it doesn't seem to make sense that you would switch from the reference product to the biosimilar. If you've demonstrated that the agent isn't working, maybe you've even done empiric dose escalation or gone so far as to look at therapeutic drug levels, you may understand more about what's going on, but going to the biosimilar here would not be the right thing to do. And that's something we have to also explain to patients. I think it's important, even if we understand it at a core level and we're not going to write the prescription, we also mention that because we're anticipating payers won't put this together. So you may say, you know, I need to cycle you to another anti-TNF in class, and then the insurance company will say, I know that your doctor wanted you to get adalimumab as your next drug, but we've got a special this week on the biosimilar infliximab. Would you like to try that? Or they don't say it that way, but you know what I mean, guys. The third scenario is the stabilized responder. This is what we would call potentially the non-medical switch. The patient's doing well on an agent, and is it okay to just switch them over? Well, the European and Asian data so far, all this open label experience, and then the Switch study you saw with the caveats that it had a weird endpoint and we can't really do the subset analyses, suggests that this might be safe in one direction. As Brian educated you, there have been these subtle changes in the molecules that occur even with a single agent, so that might be okay. And then for a patient who's losing response, it's very important to remember and to teach your patients that the patient who's lost response to the reference agent or the biosimilar due to anti-drug antibodies, the biosimilar or the reference agent, depending which direction you're going, there will be cross-reactivity. So again, if the payer says, I know you want to go to this other agent because they developed anti-drug antibodies, but we're going to give you the biosimilar, that is the wrong thing to do. Your patient will have a hypersensitivity reaction. So think carefully, and that's part of the discussion you're going to have with the patients. Patients do have a right to know what medication they're receiving. That's a thread through all the different position statements of the societies around the world. And of course, we'd like patients to understand what agent they're receiving. It's a bit complicated, as you've heard from a couple speakers, actually all three speakers, that we have these suffixes now that are used. So we have to have an understanding of what agent the patient's receiving, and the patient needs to know, and we have to try to keep this straight in our minds and in our records. Now, there's been a variety of different efforts to quantify the economic impact of biosimilars. I think this is complex. It could be a whole lecture unto itself, although perhaps a very boring one. But the point here is that as the biosimilar has come to market at a lower price, it's taken over a market share. And so what you're seeing here on the right are graphs of different countries in the European Union. And as the biosimilar CTP13 became available, you can see that its market share grew, even when the CTP13 was the same price as the reference infliximab, its market share grew. I'm not sure exactly why that occurred. The other thing to understand, and I would focus on the US market, which is what I know more about, is that there's no way that we're expecting patients to save money. Maybe the health system will save money, maybe the payer will save money or make more money by saving that money, but we don't expect patients' co-pays to go down. We don't necessarily expect that they're going to have more access to the agents because somebody's going to change the criteria for getting your patient pre-authorized or reauthorized. So unfortunately, I'm cynical about that. And lastly, how should we be teaching our patients about this? Because this may sound a bit daunting in your 10-minute visit with your patient or whatever time you have when you're going over so many things that you have to talk about with your complex patients. There are some resources. So you saw the FDA resources, which I would suggest are useful for you and for your team. But for patients, you want to also think about how you can refer them to some useful resources. So there's a webinar that I did with one of my colleagues who's on the Government and Industry Affairs Committee that's available through the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation website. And there are some other resources that you might find useful, and these have been made directly for patients. I know also that the AGA, working with the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, are working on some educational materials as well. And so lastly, I'll summarize the society position statements to encourage you to engage your patients, empower them, and perhaps together we can make sure that we're doing the best we can. In 2015, the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation issued their position statement. They accepted extrapolation, which was at the time distinct from the Canada Health position statement, although that's been modified. We wanted the FDA to ensure thorough human testing, which of course they do. We wanted the FDA to provide reasonable proof that switching would not incur immunogenicity or loss of response, which I think it has done to a degree, but not completely. We wanted to make sure that it was clear that the risk of cross-reactivity and immunogenicity of anti-drug antibodies from the innovator or reference agent to the biosimilar was being understood and communicated effectively, and we also requested unique identification numbers or names, which they have actually done now. We also encouraged this shared decision-making and transparency model, meaning that patients and the providers should have a right to refuse a switch if they think it's not safe. They should have the right to write a prescription as dispensed as written, and we wanted that to be part of our platform. I'll tell you that in the real world, that's not really happening. It's just wholesale switching across infusion centers, third-party pharmacies, and specialty pharmacies right now. In 2016, ECCO issued their position statement on biosimilars, mostly the same as what I said. I'm not going to read through all of this, but they emphasize that they have accepted extrapolation of indication. They want registries and ongoing observational studies with long-term follow-up for safety. The adverse events and loss of response due to immunogenicity needed some more study, and they wanted to emphasize that important point that I've already mentioned. They also wanted to be able to trace and audit which drugs patients were receiving if there were concerns. And they said in their position statement that switching was acceptable after appropriate discussion between the healthcare team and a patient. The updated recommendations from Canada, and this was their updated recommendations, said that the authorization of a biosimilar was not a declaration of equivalence to the reference drug, but interchangeability can be determined at a provincial level. Doctors and their patients should be able to select the treatment option best suited to each patient's individual circumstances. So again, getting back to this, ultimately we should be able to decide and help influence these decisions, not a third party. And the patient who's in remission being treated with a reference or innovator product should not be forced to switch. A similar theme across all of these. Now, most recently in my last slide is just the update from the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. This is in draft form, so don't hold me to this because we haven't reviewed it formally, but I wanted to share it with you because it's in the last week that we've been updating this. Just continuing to remind our colleagues and the patients that no biosimilar has achieved that interchangeable designation. We want patients and physicians to be informed of potential switches. That was in our original statement, but we're emphasizing it in this update. And then very importantly, we said that if a switch was going to occur, there should be no delay in delivery of therapy, because the bureaucratic problem of saying, well, this isn't what I wanted my patient to receive, and they're being switched now, or throwing the facts in the garbage when you do get notification, all those things are going to result in a real world delay in therapy, which is the worst thing that can happen to our patients. So it's not enough to say they're being switched and it happens seamlessly and everybody's happy. There's the real possibility that there's going to be delay in delivery, or the patient doesn't know about it and a new bag with a different name is being hung on the IV pole, and then they say, stop, I don't know what this is, and then 2 weeks go by, they relapse, or now they're going to receive essentially episodic drug dosing. And then lastly, which we're continuing to discuss, is that we actually advocate for transparency on the reason for switching. We know and expect that this is probably due to pricing. It's in parentheses here because we don't actually expect that this is a necessary component of everything we're going to do, nor do we think anyone's going to actually allow us to ask for that. But we believe transparency about these things is important, and the foundation is going to take a stand on that. So if you look across the states in the United States, for my American colleagues who are here today, it's a state decision how pharmacies handle this information and how they notify. I would refer you to a really nice website, the National Conference of State Legislatures. It's ncsl.org, where they update what's going on state by state across many different issues, but you can look up the biosimilars, and they summarize some of the issues that have been raised. The individual patient should be notified that a substitute or switch has been made, and that provision is now included in at least 12 states in the U.S. And in some cases now state law requires patient consent before any switch is made. So you need to know what state you're in, and you need to go to that website and look it up, and you can know what tools you have at your disposal on behalf of your patients. It's also not really known whether it will matter at all what these laws are and if anyone's going to enforce them, unfortunately. So I hope I've given you some nice guidance and practical points about what you can do with this, because these agents are here. As you've heard, extrapolation has occurred, and their drugs are now going to be in our patients. And I think there's a variety of important pieces of information you should be communicating to them in order to be most effective and to engage your patients as your partners in this process. Thank you very much.